makes you nervous, he backs off and allows you to relax. But basically, he is most comfortable himself within the intimate relationship. And of course, the famous Leary grin was already part of him. The best results come when you fuck someone you really love during the acid trip, he said that day. That's when the nervous system is most open, most unconditioned, and ready to take a completely new imprint. Tim was delighted that the reporter understood enough psychology to translate terms like zero-sum game, reinforcement, transaction, etc., and he was especially pleased that, unlike any other interviewer he had ever met, this reporter was familiar with his book, Interpersonal Diagnosis of Personality, and wanted to question him about how the space-time transformations of the psychedelic voyage correlate with his space-time definitions of personality types in that work. LSD takes you out of the normal space-time ego, he said concisely. I always go through a process in which the space game comes to an end, the time game comes to an end, and then the Timothy Leary game comes to an end. This is the peak, and at this point a new neurological imprint can be made because all the old imprints are suspended for a while then. The reporter asked about the impression that he had encountered on peyote and others had encountered on LSD, that one is actually out of the body at that crucial moment. Until I can design an experiment to really test that one out, Timothy said, I just don't know. Its game comes to an end, the time game comes to an end, and then the Timothy Leary game comes to an end. This is the peak, and at this point a new neurological imprint can be made because all the old imprints are suspended for a while then. The reporter asked about the impression that he had encountered on peyote and others had encountered on LSD, that one is actually out of the body at that crucial moment. Until I can design an experiment to really test that one out, Timothy said, I just don't know. It's merely subjective at this point. Indeed, the reporter's most persistent impression throughout the day was that Timothy Leary was a man who hated, loathed, and despised anyone who would commit the epistemological sin of speculating beyond the data. Every question asked him was answered either with a summary of experimental results or with a promise that he hoped to find a way to check it experimentally as the work proceeded. Leary emphasized, as he did to all reporters, that the psychedelic drug experience is a synergetic product of three non-additive factors. 1, the dosage of the chemical used. 2, the set, the subject's expectations, emotional status games, personality profile, etc. And 3, the setting, the actual events in space-time. This reporter understood him perfectly and quoted him accurately. We have often wondered why other reporters understood him so poorly and misquoted him so outrageously. The synergetic theory of dosage, set, and setting may be Dr. Leary's outstanding contribution to the science of psychopharmacology. We will talk later about his contributions to other sciences, but journalists in general understood him about as well as one who might write that Einstein discovered E equals something or other. Mostly we talked about game theory that day. Timothy had indeed been playing baseball on the Millbrook lawn when we arrived, and baseball thereupon haunted our conversation on the metaphoric level. He had thrown out the concepts of psychologist and patient back in '57, replacing them with research team, because he was convinced of the hierarchy implied in psychologist, top dog, and patient, bottom dog, predetermined certain conclusions. Now he wanted to examine all interpersonal relations in terms of the Morgenstern von Neumann game model. According to economist Oscar Morgenstern and mathematician John von Neumann in the epochal theory of games and economic behavior, most human transactions can be analyzed mathematically by treating them as if they were games. Leary had written his Ph.D. on group therapy, at a time when one of his faculty advisors indignantly told him, "Young man, group therapy is a contradiction in terms," and had analyzed personality as a group process defined by rules of interpersonal politics. More simply, he refers to these stereotyped group processes of reality definition as games. What are the players actually doing in space-time? Leary asked rhetorically that day. Who's at bat? Who's pitching? What are the rules of the game? How many strikes before you're out? Who makes the rules? Who can change the rules? These are important questions. Anybody around here caught talking about sickness or neurosis or ego or instinct or maturity or any of that metaphysical jabberwocky gets thrown the hell out. Leary went on to reject virtually all psychological terminology as pre-scientific and vague. "We've got a contract among ourselves," he said, "that we're going to talk sense, and that means specifying where the bodies are in space-time and what sort of signals they're exchanging." This was the basic methodological position of post-Einstein physics, but Leary was carrying it as far as it could be taken. Nobody was sane or insane, right or wrong, hallucinating or not hallucinating. All those words were value judgments relative to the observer's prejudices. What was happening in interpersonal relations, described objectively and relativistically, was various parties or coalitions bargaining for control of neuromuscular space, ethnological territory, or the right to define the game for all other players, ideological territory. Leary's arch-rival at Harvard, Dr. B.F. Skinner, had been a pioneer of the behaviorist approach, which rejected the intuitive and poetic psychologies of Freudians and Jungians as unscientific. While Leary agreed with this, he felt that Skinner himself had taken an equally wrong turn, using as model the push-pull, action-reaction mechanisms of Newtonian physics. "Psychology doesn't become scientific by copying the physics of past centuries," Leary said to me. "We've got to learn to use the best models in the physics of this century." Such models, he felt, will be relativistic, describing differing reality coordinates experienced by different bodies as they exchange signals in space-time. So many people were bemused or bewildered by Leary the guru in the next few years that this background of his work was never fully understood. During the prisoner rehabilitation project of 1961 to 62, for which Dr. Leary was commended by the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, Timothy refused to let any co-workers speculate on whether their cons were getting sicker or better. Where are their bodies in space-time? What signals are they exchanging, he would ask again and again. He had developed a 7-dimensional game model and insisted on analyzing all behavior in terms of the 1. Roles being played, 2. Rules tacitly accepted by all players, 3. Strategies for winning or for masochistic winning by losing, 4. Goals of the game, purpose served, 5. Language of the game and the semantic worldview implied, 6. Characteristic space-time locations, and 7. Characteristic movements in space. "If you can't describe those 7 dimensions of a group's behavior, you don't understand their game," Leary told the reporter. "Most so-called neurosis is best analyzed as somebody programmed to play football wandering around in a baseball field. If he thinks football is the only game in the universe, the other players will seem perverse or crazy to him. If they think baseball is the only game, he'll seem crazy to them." The Tibetan Book of the Dead, Leary added, was the manual for one type of consciousness-altering game. It was useful for LSD reprogramming sessions because LSD suspends imprinted neurological games and allows us to imprint new games. Rubicek, a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist, had proposed in 1957 that LSD suspends conditioned reflexes. Leary was the first to suggest that LSD acts below the conditioning level and directly changes basic imprints, i.e. neurogenetic limits usually not changed by either conditioning or counter-conditioning. "You're really talking about using these drugs to change the whole personality," the reporter said at one point. "Ego and mind and emotions and all." "Yes," Tim said. "That's the whole point. LSD with the right set and setting can change anything we consider ourselves. Therefore, it's the most potent brainwashing agent in the world. That's what my 2 commandments are all about." Leary's 2 commandments for the neurological age, published in several of his books and articles of the 60s, are 1. Thou shalt not alter the consciousness of thy neighbor without his or her consent. 2. Thou shalt not prevent thy neighbor from altering his or her own consciousness. Leary wanted psychedelics regulated and controlled by medical and psychological clinicians, according to a professional code of ethics which would protect the subjects. In fact, he didn't even like the word subjects and preferred in egalitarian fashion to call the trippers in each experiment research associates. He was convinced that the drugs would be abused and misused if control were placed in the hands of the government. Some of the recent revelations about CIA research dramatize what Leary fears. An ideal re-imprinting clinic, as Leary visualized it, would work like this. Assume you have a personality problem that you want to change. Maybe you're a foot fetishist, or you drink too much, or you feel you can't learn mathematics, or you're incompetent with tools, or whatever. You go to the clinic and discuss the problem with a behavior change expert. He explains the theory behind psychedelic imprinting and gives you a batch of literature clearly stating the pros and cons of the theory, i.e., including articles by those who claim it doesn't work or is too dangerous. You think it over for a week. If you decide the theory looks good, you make another appointment, and if the staff has decided you are a safe subject, not pre-psychotic or otherwise vulnerable, the program for the trip is worked out jointly between you and the behavior change expert assigned to your treatment. The program will probably include music and ritual, but may be as simple as just relaxing your tense muscles one by one. At the peak, the imprint is made. You emerge with a new reality. What was invisible or impossible before is now part of yourself and your perceptual field. Leary used this technique with the prisoners in the Convict Rehabilitation Project and claims to have cut the recidivism, new crime rate, by 80%. Leary had defined success or failure in terms of where the bodies were in space-time 2 years after release from prison. At that time, he noted gladly, over 80% of them were still outside prison, whereas the majority of released convicts are back inside prison within 2 years. Dr. Walter Houston Clark, in 1976, noted that the bodies of most of Leary's convicts known to him were still outside prison in space-time after 15 years. Dr. Richard Alpert used the same methodology to treat a compulsive homosexual who wished to become capable of sexual relations with women. 3 sessions only were required, one of them spent in creating the program in collaboration with the patient. 2 LSD trips with A, pornography, and B, a female sex therapist imprinted the new reality. The man became mostly heterosexual. No behavior modifier working without LSD has claimed such a transformation in less than several months of conditioning. Please note, one more time, that Dr. Leary never claimed such outstanding results could be obtained without the proper setting, and full cooperation and communication between the person seeking behavior change and the clinician or clinicians on the case. Within these parameters, and guided by his 2 commandments, he claimed highly beneficial results could be obtained. He specifically warned that ignoring these parameters was a kind of mind rape which could be severely traumatic to the subject, being experienced as both coercive and terrifying. The most important rule, he told the reporter vigorously, is that the tripper decides what behavior change is desired. Nobody else has the right to decide for him. That day in 1964, I found this Einsteinian and anarchistic variation on Skinner's 1984-ish behavior mod both exciting and hopeful. I decided that Dr. Leary would definitely need to be watched. Here was a man, I said to myself, who will do important work in the next 10 years. I had no intuition at all that Dr. Leary would actually spend 4 of those years fighting to stay out of jail, and the other 6 struggling to get out of jail. The Queen of Space. A few weeks after my meeting with Dr. Leary at Millbrook, my family had our first UFO experience. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. We were living in northern New Jersey, and I was commuting daily to my job at Fact magazine. Our house was at the bottom of a hill, and one Saturday morning while I was home, the kids came running in to tell me that a flying saucer had just landed up near the top of the hill. I went to the backyard to find the neighboring family equally excited. Altogether, 6 adults, the author and his wife, plus 4 from the neighboring clan, which was Appalachian and huge, together with 7 children, ours and theirs, had seen what looked like a silvery, saucer-shaped craft landing. Everybody was taking turns looking at the landing site through a pair of binoculars. When it was my turn, I saw what looked like a bucky-full geodesic dome, where none had been before, and no human or humanoid figures. Others saw a more saucer-shaped craft, and some saw humanoids in silvery costumes. Then it, whatever it was, took off. It definitely was not a geodesic dome. Watching it take off, I decided it was probably only a helicopter. That afternoon, my son Graham encountered an extraterrestrial in the woods behind our house at the foot of the hill. She was female with silvery skin, and she told Graham, he was 5 at the time, that he should become a physicist when he grew up. Professor Jacques Vallée, who has analyzed all such contact stories that have occurred since 1890 with a computer to find statistical patterns, informs us that this is drearily typical. The majority of child contactees, Vallée has discovered, report female extraterrestrials. The majority of adults report males in two standard types, small green men or giant blue men. In fact, Dr. Vallée has found 44 parallels, similarities of image, word, and detail, between the average experience of child contactees and the miracles attributed to the Blessed Virgin Mary in Catholic countries. The UFO and the BVM, he has said, only half-jokingly, seem to be the same phenomenon. The lady most often appears to children, whether she comes in a spaceship or from heaven. She is accompanied by flashing white lights, usually, and at her best she is capable of suspending the laws of physics in clear view or telepathically shared hallucination of huge crowds. I have asked Graham, who is now studying to be a physicist, in accord with the lady's urging, to retell the tale again, to check the accuracy of my memory. Graham especially emphasized the odd silvery costumes of the humanoid figures seen on the mountain before the lady appeared. An old friend, Marilyn Pooler of Las Vegas, who was living in that part of New Jersey at that time in 1964, coincidentally arrived to visit us in Berkeley 2 days after the above account was written. Quite spontaneously, with no knowledge of Graham's experience, she told of 2 seeming extraterrestrials she had seen about the same time in 1964, late summer, approximately 30 miles from our home. She is one of the many contactees who suffered amnesia and can recall only seeing the critters without further details. 20 minutes later, she awakened as if from trance, and they were gone. Both wore silver uniforms. Catholics now call the BVM Our Lady of Space. She is, of course, another archetype from Jung's collective unconscious and was around long before Christianity. The Egyptians called her Nuit and connected her specifically with the star Sirius, but depictions of her go back at least to cave statues dated circa 30,000 BC. Robert Graves, in his famous and highly controversial The White Goddess, tried to prove that worship of her was humanity's oldest religion and originally involved the use of the psychedelic mushroom Amanita muscaria. American Indian shamans knew her too and call her Peyote Woman. She is the female version of Mescalito. She also appears, amusingly enough, in The Wizard of Oz as the Bubble Witch. In the film of that novel, each of her appearances begins with a bright silvery globe descending from the sky, after which she appears where the globe lands. This is the way child contactees generally report her, according to Vallée, and the silvery globe was also around in some of her miracles under the guise of the BVM at Lourdes and Fatima. In one of her miracles at Fatima, she caused the sun to plunge directly toward Earth in the shared experience or hallucination of over 100,000 witnesses. If you believe the sun really did plunge toward the Earth, you are naive, in my estimation. But if you accept that 100,000 persons can telepathically share the same hallucination, you must then answer the big question, or perhaps I should call it the Whig question: how much of consensus reality is similarly created? The 23 Enigma.